So it's 2 o'clock. I suggest that we start. There are quite a few of us already in the call, and of course our very special guest has already joined. So we're very happy to be welcoming all of you. And so I will start. My name is Ela Serdaroğlu. I'm the Global Shelter Cluster Coordinator on behalf of the IFRC. I will be doing the opening remarks and the introductions, and of course my colleague Brett will be doing the closing remarks at the end of the session. And just for the record, because we have a lot of online meetings at the moment, you are at the Global Shelter Clusters annual meeting to listen to the keynote address by the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. Good morning, sir, to you. And we're very happy to be able to welcome you to our meeting, and we are very keen to listen to you in the coming hour or so and exchange ideas. We also welcome, of course, colleagues from the Special Rapporteur's mandate. I think Mr. Gunnar Thiessen is joining us, and he will be able to stay a bit longer after the Special Rapporteur leaves the session. So, as you will have seen from the session outline, today Mr. Rajagopal will share with us a few words on his role and working methods for those of us maybe who are not dealing with it every day, as well as his vision for the coming years. We're also very interested in hearing thoughts on the role of shelter and housing in achieving the broader impact and well-being of people's lives. And of course, as well as how we can work together to bring the humanitarian sector closer to achieving the longer term goals, and how we can work on these together. Before I give the floor to him, I would like to give an overview of the session, because we have to keep a bit of a tight schedule today. So we will be hearing from the Special Rapporteur for about 20-25 minutes, as long as he would like to share his thoughts with us. Then we will have a question and answer session, who will be moderated by my colleague, Iran Susere Lassa from Habitat for Humanity International. She is a Global Senior Director for Disaster Risk Reduction and Response. So for the Q&A session, I would like to request everyone to ask a single question, because there are many of us and we want to hear from as many people as possible. So try to ask a single question, not a compound question with many sub-questions. And you can ask it directly during the call, but also in the chat, but I would advise you to ask directly, because we may not be able to monitor the chat as quickly, because there are many people in the call at the moment. Like I said, the Special Rapporteur will need to leave at 3:15. So if he cannot answer all the questions or the discussion is not completed by then, we ask for your understanding. But maybe we can continue with his team on any outstanding points. And Brett Moore from UNHCR, my co-lead on this job, will do the closing remarks. I want to give you a brief update and the background on the very remarkable career of the Special Rapporteur. So Mr. Rajagopal is a professor of law and development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and founder of the Displacement Research and Action Network at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has conducted more than 20 years of research on social movements and human rights advocacy around the world, focusing in particular on HLP rights, evictions and displacement. And this topic is, of course, at the Global Shelter Cluster also very close to our hearts. HLP is one of our main pillars that we want to advance through our ongoing strategy. The Special Rapporteur served as a human rights advisor to the World Commission on Dams with the UN High Commission for Human Rights in Cambodia, and he has published numerous books, articles and research reports, and of course he has lectured extensively. So we also hope that his session with us is going to be one of the highlights of his career. I don't know if we will make it to his bio, but we hope that it will be a pleasant exchange. Mr. Rajagopal took up his mandate as Special Rapporteur in May 2020, just in the middle of the COVID crisis, which has, of course, showed all of us the importance of adequate housing in people's health and well-being. So I hope that we will be able to hear a little bit on that as well. So without further ado, I already talked a lot. You heard enough from me, and we would like to now turn the floor over to Mr. Rajagopal. The floor is yours. I will now mute myself and turn off the camera as well.
Thank you. And good morning to you all. It's a great honor to address you as Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. The work of the Interagency Standing Committee and its Global Shelter Cluster led by the International Federation of the Red Cross and UNHCR is probably the most important international coordination mechanism to respond to displacement caused by natural disasters and conflict. The fact that the global cluster supports currently 30 country-level clusters and coordination mechanisms underlines how virulent the issue of forced eviction and displacement is currently in the world. I'm delighted to reach out to you in this interactive session at a time while I'm identifying priorities for the mandate for over the next 3 to 6 years in consultation with various stakeholders. It cannot be more timely to have this first interaction with you. And yes, I'll be honored to put this interaction on my bio for sure. While I may outline some preliminary thoughts, I see this session more as a mutual learning exercise to understand also the needs of the humanitarian community responding to displacement caused by natural disasters and conflict in the field of shelter and housing. As an independent human rights expert, I have 4 core tasks. 1, to undertake thematic studies on the right to adequate housing in the form of annual reports. 2, develop soft law standards and guidelines to implement the right to adequate housing. 3, raise violations of the right to adequate housing with governments and other stakeholders through communications and public advocacy. And 4, undertake up to 2 official country visits per year to identify good practices and challenges and issue recommendations. This is, of course, currently largely under suspension due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but I hope to be able to undertake country visits next year. With the limited resources available to all UN human rights experts, the role of the UN Special Rapporteurs is mainly to be an independent voice promoting and protecting a particular human right. In my case, the right to adequate housing. This can only succeed when working jointly with the national and local governments, national human rights institutions, the judiciary, civil society, but as well as the UN agencies and the humanitarian aid community. Only jointly it can be possible to prevent forced evictions and displacement and promote rights-based approaches in responding to them. Whether my voice will have any impact depends largely on whether my work will be helpful to you and other stakeholders and finds a sounding board. Now, what are some of the key mandates so far? Forced evictions and displacement have been a core reason why this mandate was established more than 20 years ago by the then Commission on Human Rights. Next to the housing mandate, the mandate on internally displaced persons has been probably the closest associated with your work. Milun Kothari, the first Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, developed over many years key guidelines to address development-based evictions. Raquel Rolnick ended her mandate with UN guidelines on security of tenure for the urban poor. And my predecessor, Leilani Farha, proposed in March 2020 guidelines for the implementation of the right to adequate housing. Probably very well known to you as well are the guiding principles on internal displacement from 1998 by Francis Deng, the former special representative of the Secretary General on IDPs, as well as emerging norms of international law, including the work of the International Law Commission on Disasters and emerging directions of international criminal law. 9 years ago, my predecessor Raquel Rolnick submitted to the General Assembly and Human Rights Council 2 reports on the right to adequate housing in disaster relief efforts and on post-conflict and post-disaster reconstruction. Both reports have not lost their relevance. Raquel Rolnick highlighted key challenges relating to the protection and realization of the right to adequate housing in disaster response. Inattention to or discrimination against vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, the overemphasis on individual property ownership, and associated difficulties to recognize and address the multiplicity of tenure forms, equally in restitution and recovery programs. The risks of approaching post disaster reconstruction predominantly as a business or development opportunity that benefits only a few, and limitations in existing frameworks for recovery and reconstruction. She stressed that in the wake of a specific disaster or conflict, the right to adequate housing should be integral as a key component of planning, preparation, and implementation of any ensuing humanitarian reconstruction and development responses. She argued that governments, with sustained support from international support agencies, should provide immediate temporary shelter in reasonable, adequate living conditions for anyone displaced by conflict or disaster. Finally, she highlighted that in preparing for reconstruction and development, all relevant parties and actors should acknowledge that housing has an inherent social value of vital importance for social stability, alleviation of poverty, and development. In other words, housing is not only an essential fundamental human right in itself, it also facilitates the achievement of many other human rights, such as the right to health, to education, to water, and sanitation. Nowhere has this become more apparent than when this year, when governments called upon billions of people to enter into confinement or semi confinement to protect themselves and the general public from the COVID 19 pandemic. When housing has more and more become a matter of health, of life, and death. And all evidence shows that the risks from exposure to the virus and to death depend strongly on whether you have access to adequate housing or not, or whether you live in situations of homelessness, in overcrowding, or in inadequate housing in informal settlements where physical distancing is difficult, if not impossible. I will return to this point later. Raquel Rolnick also stressed that the need for effective consultation and direct participation of affected communities in the design and implementation of post conflict and disaster responses, particularly on matters of housing and land. She also underlined the right of all people displaced by conflict or disaster to return voluntarily to their land and homes. In cases where the displaced have settled and begun to build new lives and communities, their preferences to remain should also be respected and supported. And she called for sustained efforts to achieve a negotiated agreement that satisfies all parties if secondary occupants are in possession of the land and houses of people displaced. Also relevant is a report on guidelines on security of tenure, which emphasize the continuum of tenure security for realizing the right to housing, as opposed to a blunt approach that is based on formal, fee simple property rights as the only option. She also underlined that in post conflict and post disaster situations, mechanisms should be put in place to monitor violations of the right to adequate housing, including forced evictions. Victims of such violations should be entitled to legal remedies and have access to justice. Now let me turn to homelessness and displacement. One of the key issues of my immediate predecessor, Leilani Farha, was the issue of homelessness, one of the most severe violations of the right to adequate housing, as homelessness indicated a failure of state and public authorities to ensure secure and adequate housing for all. My mandate has endorsed a wide definition of homelessness, which goes beyond street homelessness, as it includes as well persons and households that have no own accommodations but shelter with friends or relatives, or who have found shelter in transitional housing provided by states or humanitarian entities. Many displaced persons find themselves either in a situation of open or hidden homelessness or in such transitional housing. However, very often they remain stuck in inadequate housing conditions or in a shelter system, contributing more to disempowerment than to empowerment and undermining the right to work and housing. Moria in Greece is just one of many examples of internationally tolerated, institutionalized, inhumane camp conditions where refugees and migrants have been stuck for months and years in overcrowded and unacceptable living conditions without offering them any perspectives, resulting in tensions within the camp populations as well as with the host community. Already in 2017, the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants had visited this camp and wrote afterwards a plain report on the inhumane and human rights violations in various migrant camps on the Asian islands. However, all warnings and concerns were not immediately addressed or effectively addressed. Semi-interned living in and housing conditions became rather worse, resulting in the end in the catastrophic fire that we saw recently that pushed more than 22,000 people into open street homelessness. All evidence points to the fact that shelters are an important element to protect people from immediate danger, but that housing first, the provision of long-term housing with legal, social, or healthcare support tailored to the needs of individuals and households, is a much more successful approach in integrating persons in situations of homelessness than following the past step-by-step model of reintegration, which is not only expensive, but often contributes more to social exclusion than inclusion of rights holders in situations of homelessness. Let me now come to COVID-19 and the right to adequate housing. When assuming my functions in May 2020, one of my first obvious concerns was the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the right to adequate housing. The mandate was quick and effective and active to respond to this unprecedented challenge affecting all of us. During her last month of tenure, my predecessor Leilani Farha issued a series of COVID-19 guidelines calling for a moratorium on all evictions and issued tailored guidelines to protect persons living in informal settlements in situation of homelessness and for renters and mortgage payers. While not particularly tailored to the situation of displaced persons or in the camp situations, I hope they have nevertheless been useful to prevent the spread of the virus in encampments and undertake advocacy efforts to address housing issues for displaced persons. My first thematic report to be presented next week to the UN General Assembly focuses on the impacts of the pandemic on the right to adequate housing. Housing has proven to be an essential defense in the fight against COVID-19 pandemic, as states around the world called upon their populations to stay at home, as well as physical distancing has been identified as a key element in fighting the virus. But over 1.8 billion people across the world are currently living in inadequate and overcrowded housing conditions. And how can several 100 million people living in homelessness stay at home and be safe? And how can people be safe from their own governments who continue to evict and displace their populations with great intensity during the pandemic? What we can currently observe is the following. First, the impact of COVID-19 on the right to housing has been very unequally distributed, reflecting pre-existing hierarchies and inequalities along racial, gender, and other lines. Mortality and infection rates are significantly higher among minorities and other vulnerable groups. Inadequate housing conditions for millions of marginalized people have contributed to excessive, largely preventable death and suffering. Second, while the pandemic continues to rage, many temporary mitigation measures have either already come to an end or may soon do so. An unprecedented spike in evictions, hunger, homelessness, and eventually mortality is therefore to be expected. Third, forced evictions have continued, if not accelerated, during the pandemic. Homeless persons, persons who live in informal settlements, migrant workers, and many other vulnerable groups are now facing worsening conditions with heightened risk of infection, community spread of the virus, and mortality. I believe these outcomes can and should be avoided, and that a better approach to combating the worst impacts of COVID-19 on the right to housing is available and possible, and that national and local governments, UN agencies, and the humanitarian community can play a key role in this respect. On the positive side, we have witnessed that in many countries and cities, things were suddenly possible for which the humanitarian community and civil society organizations had asked for many years to provide water and sanitation facilities for informal settlements, to make a concerted effort to end street homelessness, and to prevent any evictions through local, provincial, or national bans. Unfortunately, many of these measures are temporary in nature, and many countries already ended these measures or they are coming to an end. In my recommendations, I call upon states to install a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures for the duration of the pandemic. In particular, during the pandemic, there must be a zero eviction commitment from any government to avoid forced evictions. This should also include a moratorium on sweeping encampments or tents of homeless persons. I stressed that response and recovery measures should not be discriminatory and leave no one behind, including those who are discriminated against on the basis of their gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, or socioeconomic status or other grounds. Where relevant, special measures must be put in place to guarantee that groups who have been subjected to systemic discrimination and marginalization benefit from the response and recovery measures. I urge states to house people experiencing homelessness in hotels, motels, secondary homes, or other vacant housing for the duration of the crisis, and make plans to move people to permanent housing rather than back onto the streets. Homelessness should be tackled through a sharp increase in the appropriation of funding for temporary housing and for the purchase or expropriation of empty or vacant property for permanent housing. Finally, in the long term, I call upon local and national governments to formulate human rights compliant housing strategies for their cities and communities and allocate sufficient resources for their implementation. It is obvious that housing strategies must also address the situation of displaced persons. Let me conclude with a few words on my future priorities, which will be the focus of my forthcoming report to the UN Human Rights Council in March next year. First of all, I would like all of you to the current consultative process that I have initiated. Since 1st of October, I have invited states, national and local governments, UN agencies, civil society organizations, including the humanitarian community, to take part in an online survey that has the purpose of assessing past achievements and collect proposals for future collaboration and work. I would very much encourage you to submit any suggestions to me through this tool. Independently from this, I can already say that one of my next key thematic priorities will be spatial segregation and discrimination and the right to adequate housing. While discrimination in accessing the right to adequate housing has been a key topic in the work of all of my predecessors, so far there has not been a report addressing systematically the issue of spatial segregation and discrimination, mostly affecting racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, displaced persons, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized social groups. Another topic I may wish to address is climate change-induced displacement. A key part of my own academic research in recent years has been on climate change-induced displacement and resettlement challenges from a human rights perspective through the Displacement Research Action Network, focusing on displacement and resettlement in South India, for instance. While my predecessor Raquel Rolnick has already written a report on climate change and the right to adequate housing, it is 11 years old and much has gone worse since then. We also know a lot more about secondary displacement, for instance, which affects those who were displaced previously due to disasters more disproportionately. Housing rights advocates have often tried to advocate for minimal floor sizes to avoid overcrowding and ensure decent living conditions. They have done so rightly, but maybe it is as well time to think about wasteful and unsustainable housing, undermining the enjoyment of decent housing for others, and contributing to the current climate crisis. The question of what is a decent standard of living in the context of climate crisis is going to be a central focus of my work, and what that in turn means for the right to adequate housing to be realized. Many natural disasters to which the Global Shelter Cluster and its national clusters respond have also in their frequency and force been related to the ongoing crisis of climate change. In fact, the largest number of displaced people are now displaced due to conflict, narrowly defined, but not due to conflict, but due to disasters, as we all know. So I'm looking forward to discussing closely with you these issues. Finally, I would like to work over the next years on the right to housing and its nexus to humanitarian law and humanitarian response. It is a topic that goes to my heart, and therefore I very much welcome this opportunity to have a first exchange on the issue. At a very early stage in my career, I worked for the UN mission in Cambodia, where I got exposure to the multiple overlaps and intersections between humanitarian, human rights, and development work in the context of nation building. A substantial part of my recent academic work, including through the Displacement Research Action Network, has continued to focus on this issue. I supervised a major report which we published with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva on housing practices and tools which support durable solutions for urban IDPs. We put out a public statement in 2015 before the World Humanitarian Summit, for example, which stressed that given the increasingly urban settlement and dispersal of IDPs, a search for durable solutions to the problem of shelter and housing, for example, must reframe resilience, emphasize a continuum of tenure security, and emphasize area-based approaches which bring together humanitarian and development actors with local governments based on the right to adequate housing, and which are inclusive and emphasize the broader needs of the wider host communities in which displaced persons live. There are some welcome indicators, for example, that major development agencies are now willing to look at issues of displacement as part of a broader economic rebuilding and recovery agenda, which pays attention to IDPs and the wider host communities. But they remain the exception and contradicted by the neoliberal policies of the very same institutions. An additional key challenge in this context is not only ensuring in humanitarian response minimum standards in relation to the right to adequate housing, non-discrimination, and other human rights, but to ensure that people housed in emergency housing are not caught up for many years in it. Next to prevention of displacement, we need to find better rights-based solutions for displaced persons to access decent long-term housing solutions, including affordable housing. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rajagopal. This was a really thoughtful intervention highlighting both the connection of housing and shelter with tenure security, which we have in mind in humanitarian situations. The role of the governments as the primary provider of adequate housing and shelter, especially in moments of crisis, which as a humanitarian sector, we need to support that role. You also did talk about the impact of COVID in the right to adequate housing and the need to securing people in the place that they are through moratoriums of evictions and foreclosures. And you also did talk about standards of living in the context of the climate crisis. We do have multiple crises talking on each other. So I wanted to thank you for that insights and to open the floor for questions. As Ella reminded us, please do ask one question per person, and you can do it either in the chat or just by unmuting yourself and requesting to speak. So maybe while people are, oh, John has just requested to ask a question. John Wayne, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Balakrishnan, for that wonderful overview. It was really, really interesting. I noticed you mentioned Moria Reception and Identification Center on Lesbos in Greece and the recent incidents there. And it looks like Moria 2 is probably leading to similar challenges. But I'm just curious to know, you know, you made strong recommendations with regards to conditions in Moria. How can you enforce those recommendations? Is there a route access to enforcement to some of these challenges that we're all identifying over?
Hi, thank you for the question. Would you like me to answer now or hold for other questions?
Yes, please. I think that would work.
Okay, thank you. Moria is a matter of deep concern and I believe a bit of a shame that it has been going on for so long, and the situation is well understood in terms of the multiple overlapping failures that have contributed to creating the conditions that led to the fire and the massive homelessness. And it's a pity that the collective responsibility of states that must be engaged, especially in the European context, has been lacking in this case. Now, as far as the question of accountability is concerned, there is no question that from the perspective of human rights law, states who are involved in the situation bear a clear obligation to not only address the emergency as it arises, but to have prevented it in the first place and to find structural solutions to those who are actually stuck there. Now, in terms of how to move the needle forward is, of course, the million-dollar question. Part of the challenge is that Moria is coming at a time of multiple overlapping crises, which absorb the attention and the energy of decision makers at all levels. But on the other hand, that is no excuse for not taking action on an issue which well predates COVID-19. So COVID-19 cannot become an excuse for not acting on Moria, in my view. And a time-bound action plan must be prepared by all actors involved in consultation with all stakeholders that actually tries to find a solution to the situation on hand. And I certainly think that the humanitarian community and the shelter cluster in particular will have a great role to play in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have two more questions. Caroline De West, if you would like to go ahead.
Hi, this is Caroline De West. I'm the Shelter Cluster Coordinator in DRC, Congo. Thank you very much for your intervention. Very interesting and very enlightening points you made. I have a specific question related to rent. As we see more and more humanitarian responses are moving to urban areas, the humanitarian sector and specifically the shelter sector has been work on providing clearer assistance and clearer guidance on how to support urban displaced population, especially through rental assistance. One of the key challenges is often governments have very weak policies on for renters and have mainly focused on ownership. What is your advice on how we can influence and support governments to improve rights for renters? Thank you.
Thank you for that very important question. The rights of renters are critical not only for the humanitarian community and involving situation of IDPs and refugees, but also broadly in countries around the world. Renters are actually in a very weak position relative to owners. And in many countries, the regulatory and legal framework that are needed to improve or better the rights of renters are lacking. And this, I believe, has already been a part of my recommendations in the context of the COVID crisis, where I've repeatedly called attention to the crisis faced by renters and urged governments to take measures to prevent a massive eviction crisis, what I've called an eviction tsunami, from occurring. In the absence of that intervention, renters are greatly at risk. Now, the issue that you raise about the particular forms of tenure that are actually seen as appropriate in the context of urban IDPs is something that is very important and is one reason why I think that it's one reason why I referred to the past work of my predecessors, including the work of Raquel Rolnick on her report or guidelines on tenure security, where she very usefully sort of points out that tenure security is really a continuum. It's not a one-shot thing. It's not a fee simple property rights as the only model. There are all kinds of tenure options available. And we, in the Displacement Research Network, before I took on the mandate, we had strongly subscribed to that idea. And essentially, in our intervention, for example, before the World Humanitarian Summit, we called on states to actually recognize the multiplicity of tenure arrangements. Now, of course, this recognition of the multiplicity of tenure arrangements is not going to happen automatically. It needs support, of course, from key actors who are involved, especially in the area of development. And that's the reason why I feel like, as I said, it's a welcome sign that major development actors such as the World Bank, for example, are finally coming to recognize that, first of all, forced evictions actually have a great deal of impact on development. For example, as cause of poverty. There was a tendency to see forced displacement often as a consequence of poverty alone, but there has been enough work over many years that has conclusively shown that displacement and evictions, especially multiple evictions, secondary evictions, continue to push families into poverty. And perhaps a recognition of that has led uh, some development agencies to begin to recognize the role played by forced evictions. And what I want to see is them going to the next step to ask, okay, how do we deal with evictions in a way that actually strengthens the rights of those who are most vulnerable? And among the most vulnerable are renters. And so I certainly see that this issue as something that involves a collective effort by development agencies, by professionals who are involved in advising governments, by the humanitarian community, as well as, of course, by the network of local and national governments to have a more open-minded approach to the question of tenure security. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask for the next two people to ask their questions. So Guy Payne and Brett Moore, if you can please ask your questions, and we can then have two questions, because there's a bunch of them also in the chat.
Thanks very much. My name is Jeffrey Payne. I'm sorry, I've got a bad cough, so I hope your antivirus software is in good order. I was very interested to hear you talk about the multiplicity of tenure categories. I'm sure many of us know about examples where reactionary interest groups have used a disaster of any sort, including the pandemic, as an opportunity to capture land from those currently occupying it. And the multiplicity that you talk about of options, with which I strongly support, I just wonder what examples you would particularly highlight, and what sort of groups of people or organizations you would support or encourage to actually intervene in order to promote different types of tenure. I'm thinking particularly, for example, of communal forms of lease or ownership, which could protect groups in the short to medium term. I just wondered what tenure options and what organizations you felt could most be effective in addressing this issue. Thank you.
And Brett, if you can ask your question, and then we can move to both.
Thank you, Iru. Thank you to Mr. Rajagopal. My name is Brett Moore. I'm the co-lead of the Global Shelter Cluster with Ella on the side of UNHCR. So a pleasure to hear your opening remarks. I noted in your opening remarks that in one of the key areas you outlined around homelessness, that it really is the failure of the state and the public sector to provide adequate housing. Later on, you also mentioned really also the contradictions between a rights-based approach, but also a neoliberal orthodoxy by which housing is provided. I think that this is a really interesting tension point. On the one hand, we're promoting a right to housing, which does assume a state-led approach, but as you outlined and as we know, most housing around the world is provided by the private sector and provided through a highly monetized, commodified, marketized approach. How do you see the joining of these two disparate actions so we can achieve an increase in accessible and affordable housing for all? Thank you.
Thank you for those two questions, both very important questions. First, the question of multiple forms of tenure security is critical. And for those of us who have our scholars and practitioners who work on property rights, the idea that tenure has multiple forms is as you know, we say in America, a no-brainer. Really, it's kind of extremely well known, and the idea that fee simple title, for example, is the only form of property rights is something that is shed in the very first semester when you go to law school. But for some reason, the idea that property takes only one form continues to be a very dominant idea in the world development community, as well as among those who actually promote even, you know, human rights, certain human rights and humanitarian communities. In terms of what those different forms of tenure security might be, there are many that one could cite as an example. Combinations of, for example, the following models can be used to strengthen tenure security: temporary security, incremental rental or leasehold, prevention of unlawful evictions by landlords can play a role in strengthening tenure security. The right to occupy or urban commons or social housing or cooperative housing, or what we say in the United States, community land trusts, can all be used as models for coming up with, different forms of tenure security. Of course, it's not to say that full title or freehold title is not possible at all. It's just that it's on a continuum of multiple forms of security, of tenure security, and must be treated with that level of recognition. That is one among many, that there is no privileged place more than any other form of security. So the question of how to approach the matter of tenure security has to be approached by asking, well, what is exactly needed for resolving the issue of, for ensuring the right to adequate housing of people on the ground? If it is a full title approach that is going to work, then by all means go ahead. But if not, there are other forms that can be certainly pursued and operationalized. Tenure security, the other matter I would say about tenure security is that a particular duration of the tenure should not be standardized, because duration of tenure is temporary. I mean, models can range from 3 months or up to, in both occupancy or usehold and rental models. I mean, more permanent models offer 5-year, 10-year, or 99-year leases, as some countries do. But there is no need to think that freehold or full title models are the only ones that afford "quote unquote" full ownership. So the main point is that not a fixed system. Rather, tenure is a process that should result in the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. As long as we keep our eyes on that, the approaches probably will make more sense. Now, regarding the second question of homelessness, in the context of homelessness, the tension that exists between more neoliberal approaches to housing and the commitment to public or social housing, which is implied, of course, in the realization of the right to adequate housing. I would not say that there isn't any tension. Of course, there are tensions, but the tension, I would say, is a little bit deeper than simply between neoliberal approach and the social housing. The tension actually, especially in the context of climate change, goes to not even neoliberal approaches, but just everyday, commitment to providing housing security to all, and whether a commitment to ensuring housing security to all, if it is pinned to a particular concept of the standard of living, is incompatible with our ability to also simultaneously tackle climate change. Now, that's actually a very, shall we say, a question that opens Pandora's box, but it is a question that needs to be asked. And I believe asking that question doesn't mean that we need to sort of feel like we are paralyzed because it's an unresolvable tension. It is just that asking that question might make us or compel us to reimagine or envision um, a range of innovations, for example, in approaches to housing that we haven't thought of, or that are just on the horizon, or that are marginal and not mainstream, that might actually somehow make it less incompatible to pursue a commitment to housing for all, for example, that meets a certain level of standard of living, with a commitment to tackling climate change. Neoliberal orthodoxy is by definition incompatible with any approach to right to adequate housing. I just want to be very clear about that. There is no space in the human rights world for a neoliberal approach. But if you go beyond a neoliberal approach to asking whether a market-based approach, which not all market-based approaches have to be dubbed as neoliberal approaches, whether a market-based approach is compatible with a commitment to ensuring right to adequate housing, the answer is yes, of course, it could be. But it all depends on how one strikes the balance between the market-based approaches and the commitment to ensure decent housing for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move to the chat, and there's a couple of questions that have multiple votes from people, so I'm going to try to prioritize those. So Miguel Urquia from UNHCR is asking, what would be the global shelter cluster role in collaborating with your mandate in the future to contribute to improve access to housing of people affected by crisis? And then Sandra Durso from IFRC points out that spatial segregation and urban risk exposure go hand in hand. And she wants to know what actions can humanitarian community take for more inclusive, socially mixed neighborhoods as a mitigation measure, which is very hard to do and implement in neoliberal countries. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. In terms of how we can collaborate, in some ways, the two questions may be somewhat, they could be answered together, in the sense that the question of spatial segregation and how humanitarian community can actually respond to that, I think is very important. And I believe, short of course, the question of responding to displacement caused by disasters or conflict in a way that actually doesn't entrench pre-existing inequalities in particular settings, especially in urban settings where increasingly IDPs find themselves. So which assumes, for example, that the humanitarian community should be perhaps having an approach to planning and to perhaps doing an impact assessment before taking actions that ensure even short-term responses to crises that actually emerge, because if the responses end up entrenching pre-existing segregation patterns and inequalities, then while you solve one problem, you could be creating other problems or contributing to the entrenching of other problems as well. The other more practical way in which, of course, the humanitarian community should cooperate with the human rights community that works on right to housing and with planners, urban planners, for example, is in collaboration on spatial, technologies, whether it's GIS or satellite imagery or other forms of technologies that actually are capable of generating a better understanding of communities and the impacts on them. And of course, with the full involvement and participation and approval of the communities. But I've long felt that this is an area where there is a great deal of potential for humanitarian community and the human in particular, along with, of course, the development community to collaborate more effectively. Which kind of goes to the response to the first question, how the humanitarian community and the global shelter cluster can collaborate. And I would encourage certainly forms of collaboration that start with the practical, such as these, for example, or using tools that have been developed by other actors. For example, in the report that I mentioned, the report on urban IDPs that we put out in the Displacement Research Action Network on the tools and practices for urban IDPs. We identified a number of analytical and advocacy tools in which a rights-based approach can further improve or bolster the achievement of the goals that the humanitarian community sets for itself. For example, eviction impact assessments, or adopting different forms of approaches to community participation, community enumeration and mapping, and so on and so forth. And I certainly would encourage a conversation about the feasibility of these forms of collaboration, and specifically the timeframes within which particular forms of collaboration need to be envisaged for them to have impact. Because ultimately, the reason I took on this is not only because, of course, I believe strongly in the role of the special rapporteur to advance the right to adequate housing as a matter of soft law and as a matter of promoting the recognition of the right to housing in global conversations, but also in terms of having an impact on the ground. Ultimately, I want to judge myself 6 years down the road or 3 years down the road with the question of, well, what impact did you have really on the ground? And I think that ultimately we should all be asking ourselves that question.
Thank you so much. I can see that there's a couple of questions related to COVID-19 in the chat. The first one is about accountability and is asking, with the context of COVID-19 and with a people-centered approach in mind, how are displaced populations currently being engaged? And this is Jan Ndedi. And then Amanda Entrikin is asking, with the situation of COVID, how has the special rapporteur adjusted the new role so that the focus in the last months can provide an impact in the way that the pandemic has made the need for housing and access to it more urgent?
Thank you. Certainly, I did not anticipate at all that COVID-19 would be on the horizon when I was approached and I was being considered to be special rapporteur candidate last year. And therefore, when COVID-19 emerged as a major crisis in the early part of this year, it fairly radically challenged the way I was thinking about planning my own first and second year as a special rapporteur. For example, just as I mentioned earlier, country visits have become impossible in 2020. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to, engage in country visits next year. But, as we all know, that depends on a lot of, issues getting resolved in the attempt to, get COVID-19 under more control. And the travel restrictions being lifted and so on. Now, one of the most important or useful things that I found was that my predecessor, Leilani Farha, had issued a number of very specific guidelines, including on forced evictions, just before she remitted her office. And I've been able to rely on them quite a lot, and also, of course, engage with governments as especially in cases involving forced evictions. And unfortunately, the reality is that COVID-19 pandemic has not slowed down the global eviction machinery. there is literally an eviction machinery that is grinding along and never seems to stop, despite forced eviction being recognized as a gross human rights violation for over 30 years. I mean, the first resolution of the Commission on Human Rights recognizing forced eviction as a gross human rights violation was in 1993. And that led to, 7 more years of work by the subcommission, and then led to the appointment of Milun Kothari as the first mandate holder, as a special rapporteur. Unfortunately, forced evictions have not only continued, but have picked up in momentum. And I've tried both formally by raising the matter formally with governments, but also more informally with states to promote a more constructive dialogue to see if, at least during the pandemic, there is a commitment to, as I said earlier in my remarks, a zero eviction commitment because of the risks, not only to the displaced persons, but to populations at large. I mean, there is a real threat of community spread, for example, if displacement results in dispersal of populations in a way that could spread the virus. And so far, what we have are temporary measures, as I said, against evictions. And those measures are coming to an end. And I have repeatedly called attention to this. And as I said in my forthcoming report to the General Assembly, which I present next week, this is one of the major issues, the question of forced evictions and the need for more permanent measures going forward, but particularly during the time of the pandemic. And I believe that the role of the humanitarian community would be extremely useful and valuable in promoting and pushing for this idea, especially during the pandemic, to advocate with governments to actually insist on certain basic standards being met. For example, when it comes to tenure security, to refer to the guidelines that I mentioned to earlier and so on. In terms of how the COVID-19 has transformed the role of the special rapporteur, it's an extraordinarily challenging time to take on this role. It's a challenging role during normal times, but particularly during COVID-19, with the very minimal support available in the system for supporting the work of the special rapporteur, and the travel restrictions that are in place, and the inability to attend or to meet with other countries or to even go to the Human Rights Council meetings in Geneva. It has been really quite a strange time to be special rapporteur, but essentially not being able to leave my home for doing my work. So I hope things do change in the coming months, and that we are able to think of other alternative ways and working methods if COVID crisis rolls out much longer. For example, we may have to think radically about what country visits mean, physical country visits, as opposed to perhaps a mix of on-the-ground information collected through others, plus perhaps more virtual consultations taking the place of actual engagements. That's not ideal, but it also it's a sort of issue that we are all discussing as special rapporteurs, because the challenge is not just restricted to me; it's all the special rapporteurs. And finally, to add to the challenges in the current moment, the reality is also that the UN system, particularly the human rights system, is also facing severe financial stress because of the difficulties in getting many states to live up to their commitments. And this definitely will continue to have an impact on the ability of the system to ensure that the special procedures, for example, are able to play the role that they were designed to play. So these are all concerns that don't have easy answers, but that are on the top of all of our minds.
Thank you so much. There is a question in the chat that is getting a lot of traction, and is if you could point to the most remarkable initiative or action or project from states or governmental institutions that have been taken in the recent months to address the right to adequate housing. That would be one. And then I know that Miriam Lopez Villegas had her hand raised. I don't know if that's the case because I'm not seeing it right now. Miriam, do you have a question?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Rajapal. My question is a little bit still related to COVID, but not only about your role, but our role. So as humanitarian agencies, we have a specific mandate, for instance, to assist displaced population and host communities. To what extent now the COVID pandemic is challenging us to broaden our reach, or also where we work or who we traditionally help or have been helped before? Thank you. Over.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. First, let me take the second question regarding COVID. That's the idea that COVID has made the entire world into essentially a situation of humanitarian emergency is not a far-fetched idea. I mean, many countries literally have imposed emergencies, and the combination of a health crisis of unprecedented proportion of the kind that we haven't seen in over 100 years, overlapping with climate crisis, and coming in the context of terrible economic, scenarios that have not, frankly, improved much at all since the collapse of the world economy in 2008, 2009. The recovery in many parts of the world has been in name only, and many communities have continued to suffer quite significantly. And this has affected their ability to access basic rights, such as food. There has been a massive food crisis affecting vulnerable communities around the world. One reason why this year's awarding of the Nobel Prize to WFP is such an apt one in terms of timing. And there has been a huge impact on water and sanitation, on access to adequate housing, and particularly, broadly speaking, I would say on making people precarious. Precarious living has now become increasingly the new normal for a lot of vulnerable communities who are living literally from one paycheck to the next paycheck and expecting to go down literally if they have a single health crisis, if they have any natural disaster or other issue that affects them in any way. Now, this is actually an extraordinarily vulnerable moment. And I believe that the humanitarian community should definitely look at this as an opportunity to engage more actively in helping states and other stakeholders to tackle challenges more broadly. Just one example that I mentioned, when I discussed the area-based approaches, especially given the urban nature of IDPs, clearly the question of dealing with the securing the rights of IDPs and refugees is clearly connected to the rights of the broader communities in which they live, the host communities and others. And, the humanitarian community clearly can contribute to, figuring out how best, these kinds of broader approaches can be operationalized. And I know in some cases, in many cases, they have tried to do that, but it's still something that, needs to be more formally or more properly mainstreamed in different ways. And the other question of what kind of projects are particular great examples that we see from efforts taken by states or other organizations in recent years to secure the right to housing. I would say that the last 15 years have been particularly quite challenging for recognition of the right to housing because of, as I said, two factors. Well, the one factor, as I said, was the impact of the 2008 financial crisis and its continuing impact on the most vulnerable communities, both urban and rural. The second issue has been the emergence of housing as a commodity in a way that has been financialized and made as an asset to be traded on Wall Street. Essentially, a trend that was early recognized by Raquel Rolnick, my predecessor, and also re-emphasized and worked on by Leilani Farha, my predecessor as well. This financialization of housing or the conversion of housing into a tradable asset, which is totally disconnected from a recognition of housing as a fundamental human right, is one of the most problematic developments in recent years. And in terms of where some of the most interesting sort of pushbacks against that have come from, which is where I come to where you see the most interesting, sort of innovations on right to housing. A lot of the most interesting innovations that I've seen are at the level of cities and local governments. National governments continue to, of course, commit themselves to broad housing goals. They have commitments to affordable housing. They build a lot of houses and so on. And occasionally we see some good legal clarification or recognition of the right to adequate housing as a constitutional right, for example, in courts. But much of the actual practical work on housing that advances sort of the boundary seems to be happening at the level of cities and governments. So I can give you a number of examples, but certainly there have been, efforts that you could see, for example, the 2015 policy by the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, which anchors an approach to the right to adequate housing of informal settlements in an approach that is more compatible with the right to adequate housing is one example. Brazil has had a number of local governments that have enacted measures, especially during the 2010s. Spain has had some very interesting experiments, for example, in cities like Barcelona. I mean, networks of local governments have emerged as well, like the Global Cities Local Governments, network, the Global Parliament of Mayors. And these networks are emerging as alternative frameworks through which global coordination and cooperation can happen, even in the light or even in the place of collaborative efforts or in a more traditional setting, such as, for example, interstate coordination at the national levels and so on. And this, to me, is perhaps one of the most interesting, good examples of where perhaps are the sites where right to housing can be concretely addressed and advanced.
Thank you so much. We still have, I think, 7 minutes before you need to leave us. So I did have a question that and is basically, what do you think that are the biggest challenges to achieve minimum standards for adequate housing in the coming years? And what do you think needs to change to actually make a reality the access to adequate housing for all? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, that's a question that could be the subject of another lecture. But I mean, the biggest challenges right now, right now we are all consumed with the COVID crisis, but the COVID crisis clearly illustrates that we had already been living in or through multiple forms of crisis. The COVID crisis really kind of lifted the veil on pre-existing crises that many societies have been living with. For example, the pre-existing crisis of deep and structural and systemic inequality between racial, ethnic, and other minority groups and others. The impact of the impact of COVID has been disproportionate on people who belong to weaker sections of society, of minorities in many countries who have paid quite a steep price because of, as you can tell from the very different mortality rates, for example, from the very different impacts they seem to have because they are the ones who tend to lose their jobs and not the ones like us. For example, they're the ones who tend to sort of have more of an impact when it comes to the economic consequences. They're the ones who are also pushed to work in conditions that actually expose them more to the risk of contracting the virus and so on. What that shows is a deep structural kind of inequality that pervades in our societies. And every society is guilty of this to varying extents. And how we can actually recognize the impact of these pre-existing inequalities on COVID is one of the questions that must be answered to really tackle the challenges in realizing the right to housing. The second issue, as I said, has to do with the approaches to global and national economic policies that have not only contributed to creating the 2008 crisis and the anemic responses to the effects of the crisis on the most vulnerable, but also ramped up efforts to create assets out of housing, for example, that are financial, traded financial assets that are disconnected from the recognition of housing as a human right, and a recognition of these forms of the economic roots of these crises will hopefully lead to popular demand and movements, which then, of course, influence states and governments to ensure that there is a more human rights friendly approach to economic building and recovery in the post-COVID phase. That is one more challenge. The third challenge in realizing the right to adequate housing, as I said, comes from climate change and the basic tension that we've been discussing already, the tension between a commitment to ensuring housing for all as part of a recognition of the right to a particular standard of living, and what we all assume the standard of living to be, and whether that preconception about what that standard of living is compatible at all with our efforts to also simultaneously tackle climate change as a crisis. That is a very deep question with profound consequences on the way we imagine our work and in multiple professions and communities of practice. So these are not, of course, the only challenges to the right to adequate housing. The most immediate challenges are things that I'm dealing with, like on a practical basis, like the continuing, number of forced evictions carried out by states against their own people, for example, right in the middle of the pandemic, or the fact that temporary measures against evictions or temporary protections for renters are expiring or have expired, and the winter is coming now with the rates perhaps of infections about to go up, and there many of the temporary measures are expiring or will expire in the middle of the winter. Homelessness might increase during the winter, which is a matter of deep concern for me. Evictions might be happening with equal ferocity during the winter. So these are all practical concerns that I will have to, and others will have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But the bigger challenges are the structural challenges, as I said. Those are critical to realizing our joint commitment to realizing the right to adequate housing.
Thank you so much, Mr. Balakrishnan and Rajagopal, for pointing out all of the challenges that we are all facing for the right to adequate housing, and that COVID-19 has made even worse, and that we will need to monitor. I am going to pass the baton now to Brett Moore. He's the other Global Shelter Cluster Coordinator on behalf of UNHCR. Please, Brett.
Thank you very much, Iru, for the facilitation of the presentation, and thanks very much to Mr. Rajagopal as a special rapporteur. That was a fascinating presentation and really deep series of questions. So I do appreciate the participation of all the colleagues online as well. I'd like to say, apart from wholehearted thanks for the thoughts, provocations, questions, discussion, but also that as a humanitarian community, and certainly those that specialise in humanitarian shelter in the contexts of conflict and natural disaster, we are well aware of the complications on the ground that we face. And so I really do believe that the conceptual linkages, the thematic linkages, and the practical examples that you provided are really helpful for us. Certainly, I'm currently here in Beirut and looking really at the interface between these humanitarian and development issues and the chronic situation that we're facing here as part of the response to the Beirut blast that isn't singularly a humanitarian situation nor a development situation, but fundamentally is based upon decades of poverty, of adequate housing and institutional failure, and capture of opportunities by the elite, which has really left a lot of the vulnerable exposed. So I think these themes are what you've largely covered as well, and it's not just the context here, it's the context which many of our colleagues here online are working in today on a daily basis, and which they've been working in for years. So we really do appreciate your thoughts. We've had good correspondence and good linkages to Raquel Rolnick and Lalani Farah in the past, and we really do look forward to maintaining this contact with you, Mr. Rajagopal. I think that the issues that you have highlighted around the chronic fragility and economic social upheaval that have been the consequence of COVID-19 really make our task all the more harder, but all the more important and relevant than ever. So I think that, you know, with connection through the presence and office that you're occupying, and thinking more deeply about these structural and systemic inequalities that we you know, is the context within which we're working, this provides great food for thought for all of us. So on behalf of the Global Cluster team, Ella and I and our colleagues and those online, we thoroughly thank you and appreciate your words and wisdom, and we wish you well. And we certainly will be participating in the consultative processes which you've mentioned, and we look forward to ongoing collaboration with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you all, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to join you all today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Rajagopal. And with that, we conclude the session. So thank you for all the colleagues online and our best wishes. And we look forward to seeing you in the next sessions of the Global Shelter Cluster series of online events for the month, including the Ignite session with colleagues from the World Bank, the Health Cluster, and field representation as well, which has now been rescheduled to next Thursday. So thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.